So now I can introduce our first speaker. This is my colleague, Sven Anders. Sven is a professor at the Department of Resource Economics and Environmental Sociology at the University of Alberta. He's an agricultural economist with research and teaching interests in the economics of food systems, supply chains, and agri-food trade. His research has studied consumer preferences and firm behavior in the context of food quality and safety, product differentiation and competition in the grocery retailing, and the impacts of food safety standards in international agri-food marketing and trade. Extensive travels and collaborative work with colleagues around the world fuel his curiosity about the many and important roles that agriculture, food, energy, and climate change play in today's world. With that, I'll pass over to Sven.
Thank you very much, Brent. So I'm in charge of food security in Canada, and I'm sure many of you are following this topic for the last week and the last month, and so did I. And in doing so, we have come across almost on a daily basis mentioning of shortages, more than toilet paper, and also issues around the resilience of our food system and the mentioning of food security and how it's shaken by this COVID crisis. And when I did my research, I came across this quote that just appeared recently in The Economist that says, in the rich world, the result of the COVID crisis disruption is not famine, but mere inconvenience. And I'm not going to try to prove or disprove this statement, but maybe it's a food for thought for us to think about to what extent it has been an inconvenience and how severe the consequences of this crisis in the issue of food security is overall. So what I want to do over the next 20 minutes or so is to go through some basics, to explain how food security is measured in Canada, to show a little bit of pre-COVID evidence of the severity and the extent of food insecurity in this country, and then talk a little bit about a few questions that popped up for myself as I was preparing for this talk, and some of the policy measures that have put in place as to counter some of the issues that we are uncovering during this crisis in regards to food insecurity in Canada. So I want to start with some basics. Food security has been defined by the World Food Summit or the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization a long time ago as a situation when all people at all times have both physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, nutritious food that meets all of their needs and leads to a healthy, active, and healthy life. So right here we see that access, physical and economic, so the ability of accessing food are fundamental to having food security. Closer to home here in Canada, we often use a 5 A's approach to describe food security. The availability of food, the access to food, adequacy, acceptability, and also having agency in the food system itself. And again, central here to the relationship between food security and the COVID crisis is the issue of accessibility. So turning that term around, the inaccessibility stands of food and related services stands for and drives the insecurity or the inadequate access to food. And that's mainly due to the financial constraints that people are facing and that allow them to not access or participate in food markets to the extent necessary. So we could also describe food security as the imbalance, or if we have food security, the balance between food demand and food supply. But especially the COVID crisis has been very interesting in the way it has brought out the shock to this otherwise fairly straightforward supply meets demand relationship that we enjoy every day in our food consumption, which turns out to be more fragile and way more complex than many of us typically think about, know about, and engage with. And so I just want to go through the 3 shocks that I think are exemplary and stand out in the context of food security, and then sort of carry on with a more narrow focus on food insecurity and how it shows itself in the Canadian context. So we have heard a lot about how the COVID crisis shocks and have shocked the supply chain, leading sort of to troubles in getting product from producers through processors into the retail shelves where we can access them. We've also heard a lot about the uncertainty that the topic itself and these shocks to the supply chain have created among consumers and how scared they were and therefore ran to supermarkets and plundered the shelves for toilet paper and for a lot of other things that they thought were going to be essential to their food security or their security overall. But last and absolutely not least, the COVID crisis has brought up a broader economic, very significant economic shock, as we all know and probably agree, and especially a shock to the labor market that Bruno and also my colleague Brent have been talking about in the first session of this certificate course. And unemployment has been that shattering factor that pulled away the rug under people's feet in terms of allowing that economic access to safe, nutritious food that meets many households' dietary and other needs for the healthy lifestyle. But also not just the unemployment, but the policy responses to the COVID crisis have inhibited people from going to supermarkets, from going out of their homes and physically accessing food. And therefore the COVID crisis is an excellent but very sad occasion of an inhibition of food access, both in economic and physical dimensions. And those are the key attributes of food security or food insecurity, if you like. So in Canada, food security is measured as part of the Canadian Community Health Survey. And in every second year, the Canadian Community Health Survey features a module that's called the Household Food Security Survey module. And that has a representative Canadian population participation of about 130,000 individuals, including children the ages of 12 and older, plus the adult participants in individual households. This approach, pressing the wrong button here. This approach is a perception-based measure of household food security, and one that Canada had adopted for a while ago, and one that also now recently has entered the way the United Nations measures the extent of food insecurity in an international context using, as part of the Sustainable Development Goal that the United Nations has set for all of us globally. And the Canadian module uses 18 questions that ask both household members, adults and children, about their status of food security in the previous 12 months. And from these 18 questions, a scale is developed, which the United Nations calls the Food Insecurity Experience Scale. And as part of these questions, people self-report their uncertainty, insufficiency, or inadequacy of the food access or availability that they have been facing in those past 12 months due to financial constraints, so meaning the lack of economic access to sufficient food supply, and also report the effects it has had on their eating patterns and their food consumptions and other household-related food matters. So this approach is very valuable in giving detailed insights into the different extent and severity of food insecurity in Canadian households. But we need to keep in mind that this survey is based on self-reported perceptions of how severe food insecurity is, and therefore some people may not report the extent completely, or may shy away from sharing less shareable, more embarrassing consequences that food insecurity has had for them. So this diminishes sort of the truth and the extent to which we get a true picture of food insecurity using this module. The other disadvantage or limitation of this approach is that people that live on reserves in institutions or with the armed forces or are homeless are excluded from participation in this survey, and therefore we could probably assume that the results that I'm going to show on the next slides as part of the evidence of food insecurity in Canada are probably in underreporting or understating the extent of the problem in the country. So just as an example of what questions in this module look like, we see here basically a number of questions that people are asked and asked to respond to in terms of the different experiences, whether they don't have enough food, where their meals are not the type of meals they would wish to consume, whether they have to skip meals, whether they really don't have enough to eat, and so on, and whether they actually have lost weight, and all tracing back because there wasn't enough money to buy food for the household. So really focusing on the economic deprivation, the economic drivers of food insecurity. So using the scale, the researchers and Statistics Canada developed 3 broad categories of food insecurity. Those that are marginal food insecure, those that where households mainly worry about their food supply and consumption. Moderate food insecurity, where compromises are made in terms of the types of food that are consumed, mainly in terms of quality, possibly in the context of safety as well. And then severe food security, where households or individuals in households, including kids, miss meals. So going to school without breakfast and things like that. But what's astonishing about what comes out of this empirical assessment and measurement of food security is that food security is not a food problem. Food security is an indicator of a more broad economic or material deprivation that households that are food insecure experience. And that is part of basically a balance between the available resources the household has to participate in the food market. That means money in the bank or in the purse when go grocery shopping, and the overall expenses households face in terms of the cost of living. And this overall sort of problem that goes beyond insecurity in food is sort of, I try to capture with this scale depiction figure here. So the cost of living, which include food and other basic expenditures, but especially also the cost of housing or rent, the cost of vehicles, which get people to the workplace very often, debts, which are increasingly high in Canada, especially when we think about the extent of credit card debts that Canadian households carry, the cost of medication, that can also play a significant financial burden on households that have chronic illnesses and need medication. Those create upward pressure on household expenses and the cost of living. At the same time, a lot of households that are food insecure also have a lack of financial resources, leading to food insecurity, but also propagating or increasing the severity of it by having typically low or unstable incomes, a lack or very low assets, such as savings, such as stock market papers and things like that, but also not being owners of houses, being renters, and also having a limited access to credit because of low credit scores or already high levels of credit card debts and so on. So the one main approach to mitigating this food insecurity crisis, but also attacking the root causes of the material deprivation that often lead and propagate food security, are critical social protection and income support programs that have been in place before the COVID crisis, but that we also heard about during the COVID crisis, such as wage subsidies, family support payments, direct payments, improved terms and extension of employment insurance across the country, and also the support of small businesses, because those self-employed may also be those that face instability in incomes and other issues. So these policies that we have heard about recently have been in place for very good reasons. Are actually seem to be a step in the right direction when it comes to focusing on mitigating food insecurity, especially during this COVID crisis. Now let us look a little bit at the evidence that we have on food insecurity, and all the data that I'm showing and the graphical representations are all based on pre-COVID crisis or data. And the last round of the Canadian Community Health Survey and this food security module dates back to 2017, 2018. So the data we see here are basically 2 years old and a reflection of what the world looked like in 2018 pretty much. So overall, Canada, despite its wealth and beauty, is a country that is severely affected by household food insecurity. A total of 1.7 million households are experiencing marginal, moderate, or severe food insecurity. That is above 4 million individuals and including 1.15, 1.2 million children. And we certainly would probably think that those children have no agency in food security and therefore are probably very hardly affected by this deprivation, and which is not good for their development, I guess. So on the left-hand side is a map of Canada, and you see that all provinces and territories are affected by household food insecurity, and the northern territories in Canada are those that stand out with incredibly high levels in terms of percentage of the population that is affected by food insecurity by the definition that I showed earlier on. But it's much more telling to look at the right-hand side figure where we actually have the number of individuals living in food insecure households in those same provinces and territories. And you see Ontario and Quebec as the most populous provinces leading the pack here in total numbers, but I actually circulated the province of Alberta, which has about 4.5 million inhabitants. And then this number here, which also dates back to 2018, is over 500,000 individuals in this province alone live in food insecure conditions, marginal, moderate, or severe. And so to put a little bit more emphasis on the role economic deprivation as the overall phenomenon and plays in this context, on the left-hand side, you see a depiction of the relationship between the percentage of food insecure households on the vertical axis, tracked by household incomes ranging from $10,000 to up to $80,000. And you see that all levels of food insecurity rise with declining incomes. It's about that segment between $20,000 to $29,000, so $30,000 a year of household income. Less than that increases the probability, especially of severe and moderate food insecurity, quite significantly. On the right-hand side, we see the income sources of households that experience food insecurity. And here it's astonishing to see that 65% of those that are food insecure are actually people that earn wages, salaries, or are self-employed, which we would think is odd because those households have income as opposed to those that live on social assistance, seniors' incomes, unemployment insurance, or have other minor sources of income. So having a job does not necessarily mean that the likelihood of food insecurity is diminished. It seems to be, when we go back to the left-hand side, that having a certain level of household income that is high enough to sustain all the needs, this is necessary to mitigate the occurrence of food insecurity. This comes out nicer, or this point is emphasized by looking at the levels of food insecurity, so the severity levels in relation to the source of household income. So on the left-hand side are those people earning wages, salaries, and self-employed anymore, and we see that the extent of severe and even moderate food insecurity is not that very high. But when we look at people that are living on social assistance and those living on unemployment insurance, the levels of severity of severe or moderate food insecurity are quite high and make up the largest portions of those having specific income sources or relying on social protection programs that fall into these categories of severe and moderate food insecurity. So what we have seen so far is a depiction of the supply side, if you wish. So income comes into the household, and if not enough income or low levels of social protection, so if people are dependent on social protection, they are facing a lack of financial resources which make them food insecure. But these figures, or these two-part figures, depict the spending patterns of food insecure households. So on the left-hand side, we have an average Canadian household that makes about $70,000 annually. And you see the top three color shaded areas are basic needs that the household covers for food, clothing, housing, and related utilities. Then there's a chunk of expenditures for other necessities, including transportation, personal care, and expenditures for education. And the bottom two parts of the chart, blue and purple, are discretionary expenses that include child or kids-related expenditures, other services, and the bottom are investment in assets, in insurance, in pensions, but also in savings and other durable goods that present assets to the households that could shelter the household against shocks, as we are experiencing right now. On the right-hand side, you see the absolute dollar amounts that the different levels of food insecure households spend less overall. And it's actually interesting to see that the top three shaded areas, so the expenditure on basics, including food, clothing, and housing, are lower, as we would expect it, because these households, we already know, have lower incomes. But the big difference in expenditures are beyond what is food and basics. It is lower expenditures on other necessities that are growing with the severity of food insecurity, and it is particularly much lower expenditures on discretionaries and overall investments. So by looking at the right-hand side chart, I think this is proof of food insecure not just being related to a lack of expenditures or access to food, it is also the inability to have a financial footing or an economic status that would allow the household to overcome any form of shock, such as being unemployed, such as being unable to leave the house, or to mitigate issues between being unemployed and employed if employment is not very temporary or stable. So this depiction of spending and income instabilities also brings up issues of vulnerabilities. So I want to use this slide to show which are particularly vulnerable types of households in terms of sort of a broader characteristics, if you like. So food insecurity by household composition has an upper part and a lower part. And if you sort of carefully look at it, there's one bar that stands out. If a household is characterized by a single female parent, this household is very likely to be more likely to be food insecure than a household that, first of all, is not a single parent household, and a household that does not have children. So what we learn here is that it's particularly households with children and those that only have a single income earning parent are specifically affected to be food insecure, and especially if that single household head is a female. But food security is not just a function of having children and being a single parent or not, it's also a function of the community or the ethnic background, or I guess I'll leave it at that, that an individual belongs to. And here are two bars that stand out. If an individual is part of the Black community or of the indigenous community, their chance of being food insecure is much higher than any other ethnic group or community group in the country. Further to that, and this makes sense in terms of the economic footing that food security rests on, if an individual has a low level of education, for instance, such as not having finished a high school degree, 21% of those individuals are likely to be food insecure, as opposed to somebody having a bachelor's degree or a higher degree of education. Only 7.2% in the last iteration of the survey have been found to be in some level of food insecurity. So it's education, or it's a vicious cycle of low education, low labor market prospects, lower or unstable lower incomes that seem to be creating a vicious cycle that perpetuates the issue of food insecurity in this country. And certain sort of socio-demographic characteristics seem to be exemplary and stand for the high probability of food insecurity. Food insecurity obviously is not just about food, and it's not about the labor market. It's also leading to severe health consequences for individuals that are food insecure, and not just at the moment when they are, but also for their entire life cycle, for their entire lifespan. And I don't want to go into the probable effects of nutrient deficiencies and things like that are probably more a topic for food insecurity in the developing world. But what stands out for a country like Canada is that people that are food insecure have a higher probability to causing higher public healthcare costs over their life cycle, because they're more likely to show up in emergency rooms with issues that need not just attention, but that also lead to more costly treatment plans. Those may include diabetes, obesity, cardiovascular diseases, so risk factors that build up and are strengthened by food insecurity. To capture sort of the complexity of this topic that I don't want to spend much time on here, I chose to depict this in this left-hand graph. So you can think of food security leading to poor physical health, leading to poor diets, stress, deprivation, and related issues, and therefore to mental health. But food security is also an entry point for interventions to break these vicious cycles of physical, mental health, and their relationship with diet and what people consume. So this is something for policymakers to keep an eye on, to root out food insecurity, and therefore also help all Canadians in terms of helping the public health system. So while I was going through preparing this and familiarizing myself with research that is very active in this area, I came up with sort of 3 questions for myself. So the first question is actually, why are households that rely on food security why are they often wage or salary earners or self-employed? How could this be? And it seems to be that COVID-induced unemployment shock that has impacted lower income individuals, or those on contracts, or those that have small businesses, more likely to be impacted by this negative shock. And so the profile of somebody who is affected seems to be somebody who's either short-term employed, so not enough work, part-time employed, having some form of contingent employment, a single earner in the household, therefore a lower income level for the household overall, may not have access to benefits and employment insurance, and somebody who doesn't have a base of savings or assets that would avoid them jumping from paycheck to paycheck. And therefore, the loss of employment-related income is not only increasing the severity of food security, it's also perpetuating and making more severe the overall economic situation people find themselves in. So the current COVID-related policies that I'd mentioned before seem to be effective in countering what sort of can be described as a labor market shock. We have direct payments to households to bridge expenditure right away. We have wage subsidies, which are helpful in keeping people in their jobs and maintaining the pay levels that they should receive. Improved and extended employment insurance access should help mitigate the issues of no income whatsoever between jobs and maybe finding a new job after the crisis. And then there's labor market focused business support measures that make it easier for companies to not falter and being forced to lay people off. So while these things help right now, the overall economic deprivation that seems to be standing behind food insecurity is not just COVID related. It's a reflection of the broader economic environment, how the labor market in Canada is doing, the oil price, government expenditures, and the overall performance of the country that ultimately gets people into jobs, improves their economic well-being, and therefore is able to mitigate food security. We could say, is more charity maybe the solution to fight the vulnerability of food secure households? So more money for the food bank, is that something we should do? I found some research results that suggest that food bank use is not, or the use of charitable donations, including the food bank, is not the silver bullet to food security. When we look at these numbers, it seems to be that almost 60% of households that are food insecure use asking for financial help from friends and family as a coping strategy rather than going to the food bank, or they skip on bill payment, which is also something that has been taken on as approach to allow people to defer payments for mortgages and utilities to help them cope economically with the crisis. And we also know from research that really only a small fraction of food insecure households really use food banks regularly, and it's often more a strategy of last resort, and therefore doesn't bode well as sort of the best strategy for fighting food insecurity in the long term. For the moment being, it's very important. And particularly the investments that are being made by the federal government right now or in recent times in terms of the operation of food banks, community food centers, and other local food organizations that allow these organizations to build food infrastructure as part of the overall food policy for Canada and allow them to upgrade their operations to better respond to COVID are very important. I've been on the board of Meals on Wheels here in Edmonton for 8 years now, and just yesterday in our board meeting, we have been discussing grant opportunities that we already pursued and that we will pursue to help upgrade facilities as our meal deliveries to the frail and elderly and often food insecure and socially isolated individuals have been soaring between 50 and 100% in recent weeks and months. So in the United States, some of you may know, exist public food assistance via the food stamps program. So one could think, should we introduce, as an outcome of the COVID crisis, a publicly funded assistance program that continues to provide cheaper or subsidized access to food products to people that are food insecure? I would argue, and some other colleagues in the area have argued, that while this sounds like a good idea, when we go back to this figure that showed how much less food insecure households spend on food, that the spending on essentials like food is actually not the biggest problem. It's the expenditures on other cost of living, such as rents, which are increasingly high in the urban centers in Canada, the expenditures on utilities, and servicing credit card debt, specifically in Canada, seem to be the bigger issues than that a food stamps, US-style food stamps program could probably and would probably not address. The current COVID policy response in Canada has been helpful in addressing these, just repeating myself here a little bit, in terms of childcare benefits, direct payments to households, the ability to full mortgage payments, and also deferred debt payments, including other support that flows to families. So those types of measures are probably better suited to address food insecurity now and maybe even moving forward. So last but not least, I've been reading a lot about what happens to food prices in the grocery store, and I'm left with the impression that the jury is still divided. Are food prices higher or are they actually lower during this crisis? And I've been looking at the CPI for the last 5 years. Here, the figure on the right-hand side going from May to March 2020. And if you carefully look on the very right-hand side of the graph, you actually see the CPI for all items to go down and the CPI for food to sort of be stable almost. And then just a few days ago, basically yesterday, the business section of the CBC News wrote that Canada's inflation rate turned negative in April for the first time since 2009. And so I went back into Stats Canada and looked, and the food price inflation between March and April 2020 has gone up by 0.8%, which is not a lot. So I just want to leave that with the audience in terms of the price effect does not seem to be so severe in this discussion of food insecurity. Yet when we go to the grocery store, individual items and categories may have picked up in price. And with that, I would like to say thank you for listening, and I look forward to questions you may have.